Welcome to an introduction to Web APIs provided by Tech4 Consulting. I'm Peter Davis, a .NET developer with over 15 years of experience customizing and integrating the Unit4 ERP product. Web APIs have become the new normal when it comes to systems integrations, whether it's REST APIs, SOAP web services, or GraphQL. These technologies, which enable near real-time integrations, are gradually replacing the older, more cumbersome interfaces that rely on moving flat files between systems. As we move to a world of cloud-hosted, subscription-based software, these technologies provide us with new options for integrating systems, as well as enabling new opportunities for customization, as the more traditional routes, like ACT and AG16s in Unit4 ERP, are removed. So, how do we use these various services? When do I patch versus post? And just what is JSON, the cool kid that everyone's talking about these days? Well, this introduction course is designed to answer these questions and provide you with the base knowledge required to make you ready for building your own integrations and automated processes within tools like Unit4's Extension Kit. So join me in the next videos and let's get coding.
Right, okay, and welcome to an introduction to Web APIs. This introductory course aims to provide you with all the concepts required to begin building your first integrations, looking at what Web APIs are, why you would use them, and what tools you'll need. Although heavily focused on Unit4 ERP, we will be discussing and using Web APIs outside of the Unit4 ecosystem, and the tools we'll be using are all freely available. So hopefully the knowledge you gain here will be transferable beyond Unit4 ERP and will help you integrate with external systems. Now in this video, I'll cover why we need to understand and use Web APIs, what some of the use cases are for them, what options are available, and then where our focus will be during this course. But before we start, let's have just a quick note about me. I'm Peter Davis, one of the founding directors of Tech4 Consulting, a Unit4 partner specializing in technical customization and reporting. I'm a .NET developer and worked at Unit4 for 13 years in the UK, first in the development maintenance team, and then as a senior technical consultant in professional services. In my time at Unit4 and as part of Tech4, I've worked on a huge number of technical development projects using ACT and other tools, as well as many integration projects, with the latest ones being Extension Kit focused. All of this has been across all business sectors and Unit4 ERP modules. But enough about me. Let's begin our Web API journey by first asking, why do we even need to use Web APIs? Integrations are a crucial aspect of any modern system. Almost all organizations have numerous disparate applications that need to share data. For example, you may use Unit4 ERP for your finance and procurement management, but use other products for payroll, project planning, or HR. In this environment, integrations become critical. They allow you to link separate products together so that you can reduce duplication of data between systems and prevent that data becoming stale. You can also use the right tool for the job. You could, for example, run HR in Unit4 ERP, but may already have an existing payroll system, or find an alternative that provides functionality specific to your sector or country. Integrations allow you to move data between the two and keep everything in sync. And finally, robust integration layers allow you to build custom functionality to meet the needs of your business. You may want to bring together data from multiple sources into a planning or business intelligence tool, or build your own custom apps using something like Microsoft Power Apps. All of this is possible when the systems you're using provide a robust integration layer via things like Web APIs. Now, historically, we've tended to accomplish some of this functionality using things like flat file transfers between systems, direct database writes and reads via external tools, or application-specific tools. Think AG16s, ASQL, Postman or BIF in Unit4 ERP. Now, in general, we were able to accomplish what we needed to do with these methods, but often solutions that involve transferring files between systems were slow and cumbersome, and frequently a real headache for IT staff. In addition, some of these methods, especially the use of specific tools to an application, would require specialist technical knowledge, so implementations using them could be expensive. Now, it's important to note here that the need for these methods hasn't disappeared completely. For instance, large data take-on exercises at the start of implementations are often better served using file-based methods, as in general, web APIs really aren't designed for high data volume requests. Of course, more recent products may not have options for that, so you will need to use a web API of some kind, but you may still encounter these more traditional methods from time to time. Now, all of this leads to the new normal. Web APIs are now expected in modern solutions and are often the only way of providing customization in the software as a service world. Many modern applications are built around these APIs. As microservice-based applications become common, the various components of these applications will use their own web APIs to communicate. Look at Unit4 ERP. The various mobile apps for things like expenses and timesheets will use the public REST APIs exposed by the People platform, and these will also be used by the screens within ERPX. So what does all this mean? Well, it provides you with a standardized approach to integrations. Although different applications may have multiple options, i.e. they may mix SOAP and REST web services, those options should look the same as they do in other applications. So if you're creating an integration that uses a Unit4 web REST API, that API will look like and perform in the same way as a REST API in another application like Salesforce or Microsoft 365. When you're using these methods, you should also get the same functionality that is within the system. So if you use the Unit4 ERP expenses REST API to create an expense, it should perform exactly the same as if that expense was coming in via the Unit4 mobile app or the screen. This is unlike the traditional methods that people may use, like direct database changes, where you are relying on the developer to have understood exactly what happens in the application as standard. So things are generally a lot safer, and you won't need to change your integration if the solution receives an update. As long as the web API remains the same, things should continue working. Now, what use cases do we have for these web APIs? Well, we've covered quite a bit already, but you'll generally use web APIs for data import and export, like bringing in daily exchange rates, receiving invoices, and syncing data between applications. For example, sending product prices to an external purchasing tool. Reporting is another area that benefits. Traditionally, you might generate invoices, purchase orders, or payslips using batch processes and then email the results out. But by using web APIs, you're able to create interactive, real-time web portals to provide these reports. Rather than emailing a supplier a purchase order, you might provide them with a web portal where you can log in and view them, or where they can log in and view them, alongside other data that they may have. Customization is another way web APIs are used. In earlier versions of Unit4 ERP, we might use ACT to, for example, customize the expenses screen. The problem with this is that the changes made to that screen wouldn't be available to the mobile app. Now though, with the mobile app using the same APIs that you have access to, there isn't any reason why you can't create your own mobile app specific to your organization and then roll that out to your users. Finally, automating processes is a key component of making applications user-friendly and eliminating manual steps that may be prone to errors. Now, a customer can be created in an external tool like Salesforce and pushed automatically into Unit4 ERP. Suppliers can be created in Unit4 ERP and their details automatically checked against something like Companies House. Now, throughout this introduction, we've talked about web APIs, but what exactly are they? Well, we use web API as an umbrella term for several different things. In general, if you're talking about web APIs, you will normally be referring to HTTP-based REST APIs. These are the most common you'll come across and are widely supported by third-party integration tools. But there are other types, all of which provide similar functionality. SOAP web services are an alternative to REST, and several of these are provided by Unit4 ERP7. For example, the ERP7 Expenses app uses the SOAP web service rather than the new REST API. These are generally supported by external tools, but they are becoming less common and often replaced by REST APIs. GraphQL is less common and provides a query language for APIs where you can be very specific about the data you want returned. Whereas a REST API call will normally return data applicable to a specific record type. So for example, if you get a supplier, you'll receive back just that supplier. In GraphQL, you can make a single request that returns some supplier data, some customer data, some invoice data, and whatever else you choose. Finally, gRPC is a faster alternative to REST. There is less support for it, and it's generally used for things like internal or private communication between application services. And you probably won't come across this when it comes to integrations you'll be putting in place. Now, there are several key aspects that it's useful to understand when it comes to web APIs. There are standards. So REST or SOAP APIs from different providers should conform to the same standards, albeit with data models specific to that application. You are able to send files, but in general you'll need to transform those files first. So from or to a specific encoding, like base64 or a byte array in order to do this. And these methods are normally provided by external tools used for the integrations. You'll need to become familiar with JSON and possibly XML. For REST APIs, JSON and XML is generally interchangeable, as long as you tell the API what format you're using. And we'll have a look at these in more detail in the following videos. With REST though, most of the time you'll be using JSON. Now, unlike older batch input processes, web APIs are generally real-time. In Unit4 ERP, if you send in a request to create a supplier, that supplier will be created, subject of course to validation and workflow, and the record for it will be sent back to you immediately. You may find some APIs that are really just wrappers for batch processes. So instead of the created record, you'll receive a batch ID back, and then you'll need to make subsequent requests to see if this has been processed. But APIs of this type are fairly rare. Most of them are real-time. Now, be careful of data volumes. An API may well allow you to send 1 to n records to it in one go. So you could send hundreds of thousands if you wanted. But there could be server limits in place for that to start with, and in general, web APIs really aren't designed for high volumes like this. And if you send a large data set, you're probably going to get a very delayed response or no response at all. Finally, web APIs are generally versioned. So rather than updating an existing API with new functionality, a separate version would be created and you would still have access to the original one. So for example, if you have an integration based on version 1 of an API and a version 2 is released, you don't immediately need to change your integration. It can still run against the first version, and you can update your integration based on your own timescales, rather than having that change imposed on you by the provider of the API. So, where are we going to focus during this course? Although we will briefly touch on GraphQL, our focus will be on REST and SOAP APIs, as these are the most common and are both used in the Unit4 ERP product. We're not going to cover gRPC in this course. I'll show you the tools that I use to interact with and test APIs. This will include Unit4 provided tools, but also third-party tools. And there are many options that you can use, so this course should hopefully give you an introduction to what's available. And finally, I'll cover access. This will be specific to Unit4 ERP, so how you publish and access the APIs they provide, but we'll also look at some third-party APIs that are freely available to use. Now, before you dive into the course, remember to check out our other training programs. Alongside these online courses, Tech4 also provides in-person and remote training, along with workshops and consultancy. So, if you're interested in building some integrations for your business, or have other technical requirements, we're available to help you get going or even build those for you. Just get in touch via our website, tech4consulting.com, and see how we can help. And with that, let's go ahead and start using some of these APIs. Okay, so just before we dive into our look at the SOAP web services and the REST APIs and things like that, I just wanted to do a quick session just to cover what tools we'll be using when we're looking at these services. So the first up is Postman. This is going to be kind of our go-to tool that we're going to use probably in all of the sessions. It's a free tool. There are paid tiers, but you won't need to use any of those for following along with this course. And you can either run it in your browser, or it does have an option to download a desktop client. Now, we use this primarily for the REST APIs, so when we're using the ERP7 or the ERPX REST APIs, but it can also query GraphQL and SOAP web services, and we'll demo the web services aspect when we're looking at that as well. But primarily ERP7, ERPX public REST APIs we'll be using Postman for. Second on the list, SOAP UI. Again, this is open source, so it's a free tool that you can use, and it covers REST APIs, SOAP web services, and GraphQL as well. We primarily use this for ERP7 SOAP web services. That's where we've traditionally used it, and that's where we'll limit our usage to as well. We'll only use it for the ERP7 SOAP web services. Finally, Swagger. This is based on the OpenAI specification. It's not actually a tool as such. You won't download it and use it that way. Instead, it's something that is published by REST APIs themselves. So it runs entirely in the browser. When you're looking at ERP7, and we'll demo this in that session, you can actually publish a Swagger UI so that you can look at and actually run the REST APIs that come with ERP7 directly in your browser. And it's also available in ERPX, so you'll get to see it and you'll get to use it there. But that's not something you need to download. It's built into the systems themselves. So in this section, we're going to look at the SOAP web services. These are available on ERP7, and that's either on-premise or within a managed cloud environment. Now, although they aren't available in ERPX, you may be using Extension Kit to interface with an external provider who still uses SOAP web services, so it's possible you may still come across them even in an ERPX environment. Now, the SOAP web services were first introduced as business connectors in Aggresso 5.4. This was a beta release, and they were mainly used from Aggresso 5.53 onwards, so they've existed for quite a while. They're also customizable via Act, so you can add new web services, or you can customize existing web services by adding new functions to them. So there's a lot of flexibility there. Now, the original Unit4 mobile apps that run against ERP7, so expenses, tasks, and timesheets, along with the others, they all use these original SOAP web services to communicate. In ERPX, the mobile apps have been updated to use the new public REST APIs. So the question is, if these web services have been around for so long and have been replaced by REST APIs, why are we still using them? Well, as an example, if we look at the available SOAP web services in ERP7, we can see there's a document archive service that allows us to check in, check out, and read documents from the document archive. If we move across to the ERP7 REST APIs, a document archive API doesn't exist. But if we look again at ERPX, there is a document archive API. What this means is, if I want to provide an integration with the document archive in ERP7, then I'm going to have to use the SOAP web services, unless I move to ERPX, where I can then transition across to the REST API. Now, although there are a lot of REST APIs available in ERP7, and there are more so in ERPX, not all of those ERPX APIs are being ported backwards to ERP7. In addition, not all of the original SOAP web services have been converted to REST APIs in ERP7. So the long and the short of it, if you're running on ERP7, it's likely you may still need to use these web services when you're doing integrations. So how do we actually use the web services in ERP7? Well, they're all published within the web application area within the management console. So for managed cloud customers, this should have been done for you, and you will have been provided with the URIs. In an on-premise environment, depending on your install, they may not have been published, and even if they have, it's possible that not all the services have been. What I'll do though is I'll run through how you do publish these services in some of the follow-up videos. And once published, if you highlight a web service and use the test button, this is going to open up the WSDL, or the Web Service Description Language document, within a browser window. Now, what the WSDL provides you with is a description of all the functions and data types used within the web service. And this is what we're going to be using in SOAP UI in the following videos, so that it can automatically create function calls and validate the data we're sending. Now, once we've published our web services, we can use the menu-based access screen within Smart Client to grant access to those services on a case-by-case basis. Now, because these services are often exposed to the outside world, what I suggest is that you create new web service specific users within the system to access them. These will have limited access to the particular web services that you want to publish, and they have limited or no access to the rest of their applications. What this means is that in certain circumstances, you will be able to easily restrict access IDs that are required, and prevents a blanket system user from being able to access anything in the system. Now, it should be noted that for some of the web services, the data returned is going to be restricted to the user actually making the call. So, for instance, if you want to integrate with the Tasks web service, that Task web service is only going to respond with workflow data specific to the user making the call to the service. Now, this can limit the usage of some of the SOAP web services. So if, for example, you wanted to use a single user to make a call, for example, to call the Task web service from something like Extension Kit, you would only have access to the data for that user. It wouldn't be able to return data appropriate to all other users. This limitation also applies to some of the public REST APIs as well. So be aware, if you're building an integration and no data is being returned, it might actually be because the data returned by the calls is limited by the user. Now, finally, you're able to use basic authentication, username, client, and password to call these SOAP web services, but you can also use Unit4 IDS if you've got that set up. So we've published our web services and we've sorted out the access. What do we need to know to actually call them? Well, fundamentally, the SOAP web services are XML based. You'll be sending XML formatted data in your request, and you'll be receiving XML data as a response. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. Why not EML? Well, we've got to be honest here, the X is much cooler, right? XML is a markup language designed for storing and transmitting data. It's designed to be simple. You should be able to read it and understand the data, and a machine should be able to do the same. Self-descriptive is always an interesting term though. It's thrown around in programming as well, where we like to say things like our code is self-descripted or it's self-documenting. In XML, this suggests that you should be able to understand what the data represents just by looking at it. And while theoretically that may be the case, you'll often need specific documentation to understand what some values represent and what values are available to you. There are no predefined tags in XML, so the author who creates the XML document is able to name elements whatever they want. There aren't any standard ones that you'll see across multiple systems. Of course, multiple third parties may provide interfaces that all have a tag called customer ID, for example, but that is something they've chosen to use. They could have chosen cust ID, CID, or just ID, depending on how self-descriptive they want their data to actually be. So XML documents are made of elements, also known as tags, and tag and element is often interchangeable, in the same way that HTML used to construct web pages uses tags or elements to refer to the same thing. And you'll notice through the slides, I'll probably interchange tag and element as I go along. Now, elements can contain a value, they may have attributes associated with them, and they may embed other elements or tags within them as well. So finally, additional files can be used with XML. So schemas, or XSDs, which stands for XML Schema Definition. These describe the structure and the data types of an XML document. They aren't necessarily required, but they can be used to validate your XML to make sure that it is constructed correctly and that the receiving system is going to accept it. Then there are XSLTs, or Extensible Style Sheet Language Transformations. And again, XSLT sounds way cooler than ESLT. Now this is a language designed for manipulating and formatting XML into something else. For instance, this is often used to take an XML document and format it into HTML, so it can be shown in a web page. But it doesn't have to be HTML. You can use it to format your XML into plain text or JSON if you'd like. So let's break down some XML. We'll look at many more examples when we're actually testing some of the services in the following videos, but as a first example, this is XML provided by a public third-party exchange rate API. Now, fundamentally, the building blocks of XML, as discussed on the previous slide, are elements or tags. So as an example, success enclosed in arrow brackets is the element, and true is the value of that element. These elements must have a start and end tag, and the end tag having a / at the beginning of it. The elements are case sensitive, so lowercase success would be different to uppercase success. And the elements can contain other elements. As you can see in the example, rates contains multiple currency elements. And finally, elements may contain 0 or more attributes. And if used, these provide further information specific to the element, which can be read by the receiving system. Now you'll notice in this example that the data stored between the element tags is plain text. The XML schema would provide you with the details about what the data actually represents. So let's have a look at that. So an XSD or XML schema definition describes the structure of an XML document. It defines what elements can appear in the document, what the data type of those elements are, and any default values or fixed values. As you can see with our example XML from the previous slide, the exchange rates contained in the rates element are all decimal numbers, but without a schema in place, we could enter some text instead. And as far as the receiving system is concerned, that would be valid, up until it attempted to do something with that value, of course, like store it in a database number field, where it would either just simply error or crash entirely. The schema allows us to specify that only decimal values are acceptable, and so anything else would be rejected by the receiving system's schema validation before it even gets to be processed. So let's build up a schema for this document. And this is a classic chicken and egg situation. Should you start with a schema, or should you start with some XML and generate a schema from that? Generally, when you're working with an interface, you'll normally receive a copy of that interface's schema first, and then you'll create your data to match. But if you're creating your own interface, you may well start with the XML data and then create a schema afterwards. Now, you won't need to do this from scratch. There are plenty of websites available that will generate a schema from some XML for you, and vice versa. They will also allow you to validate your XML against a schema, so you can check things before you send data out. These can be really useful tools for when you're developing an interface, and they're all just a Google search away. So first up, we add a schema tag. And notice here that our schema is written in XML, just like our data is. So the XS prefix specifies we will use a default namespace, and the information about what elements can be used comes from the URI provided. Because an XML schema is just an XML document, that document has its own XML schema to define it. Namespaces, they're used to avoid clashes of element names. It's entirely possible to construct an XML document that includes elements from multiple different schemas, and because element names are determined by the author, you may have an element with the same name in both schemas. Adding a namespace allows you to prefix the tags in the XML document so that you can differentiate between them. As a quick example, the following XML uses two schemas, each of which has an element called table. Adding a namespace to each schema, H and F, allows us to prefix the element names to distinguish between them. So back to our XML, we next add the root element, which is conveniently named root in our example, and specify this as a complex type because it contains other elements within it. We also tag it with sequence. This specifies that the elements that follow must be included in the sequence they are defined in this schema. Each of the main elements are then added, and along with their name, we also provide a type. This allows us to specify that the value for this element should only be a Boolean or an integer. Now notice that these element tags do not have an end tag of /element name. The / at the end of the tag itself closes the tag because no value is provided. Finally, we add our rates element, and this is another complex type because it contains other elements, and we then specify each of the currencies that can be provided. Now for the sequence of currencies, we've specified a minimum and maximum occurs attribute. This means that each currency element can appear 0 or 1 times within the rate element. And finally, we can add our schema reference to the original XML. Here we reference our schema via a file name that would need to be placed in the same directory, but this could easily be a URI to a location on the internet. The no namespace schema location means that I'm not going to provide a namespace prefix on the elements, and the XML validator that runs should assume that any element in the document that doesn't specify a namespace should use this schema for validation. And that's it. We now have some XML that can be validated against a schema to ensure that all the data is correct. Now finally, we have XSLT, or the Extensible Style Sheet Language Transformations, to give it its catchy name. This can provide you with a way to convert XML into another format. So running this XSLT on the original exchange rate XML from the previous slide results in the JSON on the right of the screen. Now I'm not going to cover this in great detail here, as you wouldn't normally come across it when you're doing normal interfacing, and it's also pretty complex. It's effectively providing its own programming language that you need to learn, but it is definitely useful to know about. As an example, let's think about the exchange rate XML from the previous slides. In ERPX, an exchange rate REST API is provided that can load new rates. Now we could use an XSLT to convert our third-party XML from the previous slide into XML suitable for the REST API, because as we mentioned previously, you can use XML or JSON with REST APIs. But a more preferable option might be to take the XML and convert it straight to JSON. Now converting it to JSON means that we would then be able to send it directly to a REST API, or parse and edit it as if it was normal JSON document. In the Unit4 Extension Kit, we could do this using liquid scripting, but equally Extension Kit contains an XSLT action. So with this XSLT document on the left, we could get Extension Kit to read in the original XML from a third party and convert it directly into JSON so that it's ready to be sent out straight to the ERPX exchange rate REST API. Now, as I mentioned, XSLT provides its own language, and you can see that in this case our output method is simply text because JSON is really just a text document. And we can do a for each loop over the currencies in the rate element, and we can even perform an if check in that for each loop to see if the current position is the last one, so that we can correctly identify if we need to add a comma or if this is the end of our currency array. Okay, so finally, I think we've talked about SOAP web services and XML long enough now. Why don't we dive in and actually do some testing? For the following example, I'll be using both Postman and SOAP UI to interface with the ERP7 web services, so feel free to follow along if you have a test environment available to you. So let's go ahead and actually have a look at some of these SOAP web services. In this instance, I'm going to be using the ERP7 web services that we've discussed previously, and I'm going to take you through everything from publishing those web services, granting access to it, and then actually using them. If you're not necessarily connecting to ERP7 environments, or that's already been set up for you, you won't need that. But it's useful to see anyway, and it gives you a brief introduction to how you go about doing that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to hop over to Management Console. I'm using a local install of ERP7 here. So let's log ourselves in, and the web services themselves you're going to find in the features areas, in the web application, and then the default web services. Here I've already got published the Unit4 ERP web client, the mobile apps or mobile services, and the report engine web service. So if we go across to this default website and we simply right click on it or click on the add button here, we can choose what we want to actually add and set up. So in this instance, we're going to say, let's go ahead, add the web services, the SOAP-based web services. You can see that the API web services are available to us as well, but we're going to cover those later. So for the moment, choose the web services. You're then going to be taken through a little wizard that's going to ask for several bits of information. I'm just going to stick with the defaults for this. Of course, if you're setting this up in preview environments, in production environments, or things like that, then these may change, and these will probably be carried out by IT infrastructure or other consultants to do this for you. So I'll stick with the default name for the web application, the root where it lives on my system, and the application pool name, the service that's going to log in to do it. This is the only place where I'm going to do any changes, the protocol type. I'm going to switch this to just HTTP rather than HTTPS. In my local environment, this makes it easier because I don't have to worry about any certificates or anything like that. So let's click on the next. We're all done. It's going to go away. It's going to publish that. And there we go. We should see that appear. And there it is. We've got our web service up and running. Now, on top of actually publishing that initial web service, we can choose which of the SOAP web services that we actually want to provide to our users. And that's similar to the publishing aspect we've just been through, in that we click on the web services, we click on add, and then we're provided with a list of all the available web services that we can publish. And you'll notice that for most of these, there's often multiple versions. So you may have started developing against a web service several years ago, and there may have been some adjustments or updates to it since that point. So you might want to choose which one you want to publish. In general, if you're doing this for the first time, you're probably okay in publishing the latest version that's there. We could just say select all, publish them all, but in this instance, to keep things easier and a bit tidier for us, all I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to look for the supplier web service. We saw one there. Yep, so we'll click on the 2013-07 supplier web service. Choose this, choose next, finish, and there we go. We've got our supplier web service up and running. Now, as I showed previously in some of the introduction sessions, you need to grant users access to these web services in the same way that you grant users access to menu items. So we're going to do that via the Unit4 desktop, the ERP desktop. So let's log into here. And we're going to look in our users and access, menu-based access within the system admin. So let's open this up and we'll see that there is a tab for web services. If we go into here, we can find our supplier web service, and you can see by default in an EN client, which is what this is. I'm just running a standard default installation with the sort of default EN client. It's already granted us permissions here, and you can see that my system user that I'm going to be using has full access. Now, if you watch some of the introduction sessions, this is definitely a case of do as I say, don't do as I do, because you shouldn't be granting system access to these web services. You should be controlling the access because they're likely to be published to the outside world. So you don't want to really be using a user that has unrestricted access to all the system and can call anything they want. So my suggestion here is you will create web service users specific to your needs, and they will only have access to this web service. But in my case, because it's a demo, as I say, don't do this yourself in a production environment, but I'm just going to say system, fine. So we don't need anything more in there. And now we talked earlier or in the other sessions about the WSDL, the web service definition. And this details what calls are available to use. And the way that we can check that this service is running is we can actually view that WSDL. And the easiest way to do it, highlight the web service we want to look at, click the test button, and this is going to fire up a browser window, and this is pointing at the WSDL. And in here you can see details like there's a create supplier call, and that has these details with it. There's a supplier object which is associated with this call. So you can manually search through this. If you were interacting with an external WSDL, for instance, or an external web service, I should say, looking at that WSDL will give you the information you need to make specific calls and know what data structures you're going to be using. It's not exactly easy to read and find items in there. So we're going to have a look at how you can use things like SOAP UI to actually get easier access to this information. So I'm just going to keep this open because I'm going to need this for that point. Okay, so SOAP UI. This is the program mentioned in the tools area of the preceding presentations. This is the initial tool I'm going to be using. I don't use it that much anymore. Most of my work is done through Postman, and I'm going to demo that slightly later. But SOAP UI is a more traditional way of interacting with web services, and a lot of the consulting base and a lot of Unit4 consultants who've been around a while were introduced to web services with SOAP UI and still use that. And it's a perfectly valid tool to use. So it's a good introduction to using web services. So let's fire this up. As I say, SOAP UI, I provided the details in other sessions. This is a free tool. You can download it and begin using it straight away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect SOAP UI to that WSDL that we just looked at. And that's going to automatically bring in the details. So let's close this. Let's click on SOAP to create a new SOAP project. And here you go. We're going to call this supplier service. And it says, what's the initial WSDL? So let's hop back over to this web page, which again, if we'd gone into the management console, clicked on our web service, clicked on the test, it's going to fire up this web page. So let's grab this, head back over to SOAP UI, paste it in. There's a couple of options you can choose. It gives you the option to create requests. We're going to keep that because what it's going to do is it's going to give us some dummy requests to start going really quickly with. You can create test suites to test things against and store everything differently. Don't worry about any of this. We're just going to give it a project name, the WSDL, and the create request. So just click on here. It's going to go away. It's going to read that WSDL, and it's now produced the calls that we can make via that web service. So you can see things like there's a get supplier call, there's a create supplier call, get a list of suppliers. So everything that's available to you is in here. If we click on request 1, this is a request that SOAP UI has generated for us to show this is the call and these are the details we need. We'll look at something a bit simpler to start with and probably as our example, and we're going to just use the get supplier call. So let's click on our request 1. You can see this is a much simpler thing. Now, before I go any further on this, I'm very briefly going to hand over to an alternate version of myself who's going to give you a little introduction to the structure of a SOAP message. What tags you need, what's optional, what isn't, and what all the things mean in there. Don't worry, I've got my switch. I'll wait for you. So just come back when you're ready. So let's have a brief look at the SOAP message structure. We've been through XML in the previous sessions where we've explained the structure of XML documents, the elements and things like that. And this is just going to clarify the XML structure for a SOAP message itself. So the first part is the envelope element. And this identifies the XML document as being a SOAP message. And this element can be accompanied by a header element, which we don't have here as it's optional. But if present, this may contain application-specific information. We follow the header entry with a body element. And this will again contain actual application-specific elements. So first up is the function we are calling. In this case, it's getSupplier. That's the one we're going to demonstrate here. This is then followed up by all the items required to make that call. Again, those are going to be application-specific elements. And then to finish with, we're closing the envelope and the body structure. And that's it. All there is to it. When you submit this to the web service, you will receive back a SOAP response, and that will largely follow the same structure with an envelope element, header, if appropriate, and then some application-specific elements. So this is the easiest way to look at it. It's just a simple XML document with a small wrapper around it. So that's it. Let's go back to the demo and continue actually looking at making these calls. Okay, cool. Let's pause my game. Right, let's get back into this. So we now know the structure of our SOAP requests. We've got our envelope, we've got our header, which was an optional thing, and we've got the body and the getSupplier. So let's have a look through this. And in fact, the first thing we do, let's just run it and see what happens. Now, of course, if I run it like this, I'm going to get an error because, or no information found because it's just got some question marks. So let's put in some valid information. It's asking for a company. So let's go for EN. It's asking for a supplier ID. Let's choose 1000. We know that's going to exist in the system. The supplier details only. This adjusts what information is actually brought back from the service. And this is actually a Boolean. So this can be either true or false or 1 or 0 would all count towards a Boolean. And I'll show you how you identify that shortly in the WSDL. But for our issue, we're going to say false on this one. And then for the username, we're going to type system, en, and system again for the super secure password. So let's run this. We click on the play button and it's going to go away. And actually what's happened is we've ended up with a fault. Now, why have we done that? Probably because of my typing skills. I've given it a capital F for false. So let's adjust that, run it again. And you're going to see that because we've only just published this web service, things take a little bit of time in the web service world to actually start up. So the first run against a web service is going to take a little while as everything is sort of spun up for us. So there we go. We've got our return. If we click on the XML tab, we actually get our full details of that supplier. So again, you can see we're contained in a SOAP envelope, the same as our request, and we've got our response here. So we've got our getSupplier result, we've got our address information for that supplier. If we carry on going down, there's relation values for that supplier, flexi field details for it. So, and then the general name, supplier ID, supplier name, and all those details. Let's have another look at the SOAP request again. If we'd have just said
give us a supplier details and set that to true, or maybe let's give it a go with a 1 in this case. Run that again, and you see the response time this time is a lot quicker because our web service has actually spun up now and is up and running. And again, we're only getting specific details about the supplier this time. We haven't returned the address list, we haven't returned the relation value list. And this is something that can be quite useful when these web services provide this detail, because it allows you to avoid getting back more information than you need. For instance, if you're interfacing with an external system, you might not need things like addresses and relation values when you're returning details. So this particular web service, and others also include these kind of details, will allow you to only return the information that you actually need. Okay, so I talked about the WSDL earlier and mentioned things like the supplier details being a Boolean and other aspects like that. So how do we check that within SOAP UI? Well, we head on over to the project tab where it's set up all our details. We double click on that project and it's going to load in our definition. And we can then click on WSDL content. And this then gives us a representation of that WSDL that we pulled back. So this web page is now within here. The useful aspect of this is that we've actually got a user selectable list, so we can look at the elements and we can find things easier. Let's look at the global elements, and then we can have a look at the get supplier call. And here you go, it highlights exactly in the WSDL where that is, and we can see on there that it's saying that we need to supply a company, we need to supply a supplier ID, supplier details only, and then the credentials. And this actually links to another XML document in effect, so WS credentials, which has in turn its own things. So we can compare that to our actual call. We've got the company, we've got our supplier ID, and we've got the supplier details only, and then the credentials, which is another block of text which we could go and find if we needed to. Notice here, you should generally be able to rely on the WSDLs for their information, but that isn't always the case. They can sometimes bend the truth a little. Why do I say that? Well, when you look at this, it's basically saying that the minimum amount of occurrences of company must be 0 and the maximum is 1. So therefore, that would suggest that company is optional in this request, which it may well be. The same with supplier ID. It's saying the minimum occurs is 0. So again, SOAP UI is structuring this as being an optional claim. Of course, we know better, because if we take out the supplier ID and we run, we're getting a fault back. Something went wrong, and that's because the web service itself requires a supplier ID to return a supplier. So although the WSDL is giving us information saying you don't necessarily need one, it's optional, you do in this case need one. So unfortunately, in general they should be truthful, but sometimes there are differences between actually what is allowed and what isn't. So that's it. We've got our details of getting a supplier. So what's next? Well, we've got a supplier, so why don't we try a request to actually create one in the system? Now, we can see that we've got an additional call here called create supplier. And if we open up this request, we're going to see that a lot of information is now required to create this, because we can add address units, we can add relation values, flexi group details, then we've got the standard supplier detail information like supplier ID, supplier name, and supplier group. So there's quite a bit of typing involved to actually create a supplier. In effect, you're having to provide the information that you would do if you went into the screen within the system, whether that be the web client or the smart client. You've got to supply those same things. Of course, as we know from experience, when we're using the web client or the smart client, not all of these fields are required to create something. So again, if we're trusting our WSDL, some of them are optional.
we can leave them off. There may be some trial and error in that, as we've just previously seen on the get supplier, that the true for might not be, that the WSDOR may not be 100% true. But one of the best ways to go about doing this, and what we'll see and probably use again in the API calls that we'll demonstrate later, is that to get all this information, it's normally best to have a starting point. And the best starting point is often to get a supplier first, or get the information that you want. So if we run our supplier get call again, you can see that we've got all this information. I'll need to take the supplier details off. And there you go. So what we could do is we could take this supplier details, copy and paste it all, and then make our changes and use that as our template for sending in the other response. And as a Blue Peter viewer when I was younger, here's one I've prepared earlier. I've gone ahead and done this. So let's have a look in Visual Studio Code, and you can see that I've constructed a SOAP request to create a supplier. And this follows all the standard rules. So I've been through this create supplier code, and I've pulled out everything I need and populated it as appropriate. So what I can do is I can go down and grab this, and hopefully, if this works fine, we're going to create supplier 50001 in the system. So let's copy this, and because we know we've structured it all correctly, we're just going to highlight all of this and paste our new version in. Let's run this, and it's going to go away and think about it for a second, because a creation call is normally more work than a get call. For a get call, we're just bringing information back from the database. If we're posting in data or creating something, then it's actually going to be running validation on what we're sending. It's going to be going and getting information that it needs and all those kind of details. So it's going to take a bit more time. But you can see we've sent in our information. We can look at the return, and indeed we've got a object come back to us with the same ID as we put in. So in theory, everything's worked fine. And let's go back to our get supplier call now, and let's see if this supplier returns. So we can run this, and it does. Within our standard get supplier call, it's there. And just to double check, because we always want to make sure that everything is fine, we'll head on into the system. We'll go into our supplier master file, and indeed we've got it there as well. So this is showing that we've now used our SOAP web service to get a supplier, get the details of the structure of that, and post another supplier back in. And that's it. Simple as that. That is web service calls in a nutshell. Using a tool like SOAP UI, you point it at a WSDL, it pulls out all the relevant information, generates you the requests, and you can then use those to make calls into the system, which we've done here. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to demonstrate probably the same calls, but we're going to do this in Postman, just to show that you can use that for web service calls as well. The reason I want to demonstrate that is we generally tend to use Postman for REST API calls, but you may not want to use multiple tools to do the same thing. So Postman allows us to do this as well. So let's have a look at that. Let's get rid of SOAP UI and all our other windows, and let's fire up Postman. And as I say, generally I'm using this for REST API calls because I don't do that many sort of SOAP calls anymore, but we can use it for that. So how do we get these calls into Postman? In a very similar vein to we did in SOAP UI, we have our folder area, we can do an import, and again, we can go and grab our WSDL here, copy that, paste in the URL, it's going to go and read that WSDL and it's going to import it as a collection. So we'll hit the import button, and there we go. In a very similar way to we saw in SOAP UI, we've got all our calls. Now, you'll notice that if you've had any experience with REST APIs, for instance, you normally have things like a GET call, a POST call, a PATCH call. So you would expect that doing a GET supplier would be a GET call. It certainly would be when we look at that in the public APIs, but within a web service, a SOAP web service, everything is a POST call. This doesn't mean it's updating the database, it's just the way it works. We may also see that if we are looking at GraphQL queries, all GraphQL calls are POST calls. But let's have a look. We've got our get supplier call, and if we look at the body, this looks very similar to what we saw in SOAP UI. So we've got our company, and we've got our supplier ID. We'll use our newly created supplier, and we're going to say false, and then as previous, use our system en and system super secure password. So send that over, it's going to think about it, and there you go. We get a 200 response back, and we get all that detail again. And I'm not going to take it any further than that, because the same principle applies if we wanted to create a supplier. We would head on over into here and put all our details in again. So the concept is the same. This is just showing that what we could do in SOAP UI, we could do in Postman. So if you are someone that's been working with ERP for many years now and are transitioning over to using the REST APIs, you can transition your SOAP calls into Postman at the same time. We could, of course, use SOAP UI to actually run our REST calls, or the public API calls we'll be demonstrating later. But in general, Postman is a more modern application, and that tends to be the standard that people are using. And there's a lot of information online and on YouTube and stuff about using Postman. So my recommendation for anything going forward, use Postman to do that. And that's it. That's our web service SOAP calls in a nutshell. We've gone through let's have a look at our get supplier call. We've gone through our SOAP envelope, what we actually need to send to a SOAP web service, the details of what these mean, and we've looked at our return information, and we've seen what happens when we accidentally remove something. We're going to get a 500 error back or similar to say something went wrong with our call. And we've also been through and actually published our web services. So done that through the management console. As I said at the start, that's something that may be done with your hosting provider. So for example, if you're a Unit4 cloud customer, that's probably already done for you. But this may be something that is good for you to have a look at and understand where these things live, if you do need to spin these up in, say, a test environment, for instance. And what we'll do in the next session is, when we're looking at the public REST APIs, is we'll come back into Management Console and we're going to be publishing them through there. But that's it for the moment. That's the SOAP calls. Let's join me in the next session and we'll start going through the REST API calls. In this section, we're going to be taking a look at how the public REST APIs work and how you use them. REST APIs have gradually begun to replace the traditional SOAP web services that systems previously provided, and have become the standard for interacting with web-based applications. REST APIs provide the same functionality as SOAP web services, but in general they are more lightweight and have a more flexible implementation, and as such have overtaken SOAP in popularity. In the context of Unit4 ERP, the public REST APIs were introduced in ERP 6, but have become far more commonly used in ERP 7 and specifically ERP X, where they form the people platform,
and are an integral component for interfacing and providing new functionality via tools like Extension Kit and the recently released App Studio. In ERP7, it is not possible to customize the standard public REST APIs like you can with SOAP, but you are able to create brand new public APIs. And in Tech4, we've provided brand new REST APIs for clients on numerous occasions that integrate seamlessly into their ERP7 system. In both ERP7 and ERPX, a Swagger UI interface is provided, and this exposes a web-based documentation site that can be used to not only view the details about the APIs provided, but also allows you to run the APIs for testing purposes. Within ERP7, you can choose to publish the Swagger interface or not via a setting in the management console. But if you have your system hosted by Unit4 or another managed service provider like QTC, this will all be done for you, and ERPX is of course provided for you in the same way. As we saw with the web services, we needed to grant access to them via the menu access screen. For the public REST APIs, a public API screen is provided, and you should really follow the same rules as we discussed previously. So you should only grant access as required, and you should create specific users that only have access to APIs, rather than exposing a general system user who has full access to the system. With the SOAP web services, you will be calling various different functions. So for example, in our demo, we looked at the get supplier function and a create supplier function. For REST, you can think about endpoints that you can perform different operations on. So for example, you may have a supplier endpoint, and if you issue a GET request, it will retrieve a supplier. But if you issue a POST request to the same endpoint, you will create a supplier. In general, with integrations, you'll be using the following operations. So a GET call, which allows you to retrieve data, and when you're provided with ODATA queries on that, which we'll demonstrate later, you're able to select and filter the results that are returned. A POST call will create new records, and a patch call is used to update existing records. Now there is a standard format to patch requests that we'll demonstrate, but be aware that Unit4 have introduced some specific operations to their patch requests that are not part of the standard patch spec, and which only work against the Unit4 ERP REST APIs. In addition to patch, sometimes, but not always, a put call will be published. Put is almost identical to post, but where a record already exists, an update will be made. With post, if the record is found to already exist, you will receive an error. And finally, there is delete. In general, this is used to delete a record, but in the case of Unit4 ERP, you'll often find that the delete will simply close a record by setting its status to C, rather than actually deleting it from the system. It is up to the provider of the API as to what operations they support, and you may find that some providers implement the function slightly differently to others. Now REST APIs are JSON based, unlike the SOAP web services that use XML. Now depending on the implementation, it is often possible to use XML or JSON with REST APIs, but in general you will be using JSON. And you can see this when viewing the Swagger definition for the customer's API in ERP. So what is JSON? Well, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Although it was derived from JavaScript, it is a language-independent data format which uses human-readable text. It's lightweight, so doesn't include the additional tags and attributes that can be used with XML, and as mentioned, is language-independent. And although it follows a specific structure, it is simply a text format. It's self-describing, so is easy to understand and should be human readable. But like XML, take this with a pinch of salt. Yes, the tags and data are easily readable, but what those tags actually mean or do is specific to the application. So it's likely you will need to use some documentation to fully understand what the JSON allows. And this leads on to validation. A simple misplaced comma or colon in the data can cause it to fail. So schemas are often provided so that you can validate your data before transmission. Let's break down a JSON document. On the left here, you can see a sample piece of data from the ERP supplier REST API. Now, as you can see, in contrast to XML data, it's not enclosed within tags. Rather, you have objects which are enclosed within curly brackets. Objects can contain data, or they can contain other objects. So here we can see that the supplier object contains data like company ID and supplier ID, but also another object called payment, which itself contains data of IBAN and payment delay. Data is in the form of key value pairs. So here company ID is the key and EN is the value. Commas are used to separate objects in key value pairs. And along with simple values like text, you can also have arrays, denoted with square brackets. And arrays can either include values or objects made up of other values. So in this example, the related values key contains an object of relation objects, each with their own key value pairs. Now, JSON supports multiple data types, so strings, booleans, numbers, dates, etc. As I mentioned earlier, to ensure that JSON is correctly formatted, a schema will often be provided. And based on the previous JSON example, you can see here its structure can be validated by the schema on the right. You can see that the root is an object, which includes properties of company ID, country code, supplier ID, etc. And it contains a property called payment, which is itself an object with different properties. It also contains a property of related values, which is an array of objects that include other properties. Just like XML, there are various tools and websites that can automatically generate schemas for you. And we have a similar chicken and egg situation like we did with XML schemas, where you need to decide if you'll start with some JSON and generate a schema for that, or start with a schema and then generate a document from it. Now for our REST API demo, we're going to be using Postman and Swagger. We could use SOAP UI like we did with our SOAP web services, but as explained in those demos, Postman is the much more commonly used tool. Now there may or may not be a Swagger documentation interface provided for APIs that you are working with, but because this is provided by Unit4 ERP and it allows us to use the APIs without the need to install any other tools, we'll cover it here. So let's head on over to the demo. So we're now going to spend some time looking at the REST APIs, primarily again within ERP 7. We'll also take a look at some of the ones in ERP X as an example. But REST APIs, as we mentioned during the rest of the course, are a bit more commonly used now compared to the original SOAP web services. So you're more likely to encounter these. And things like Extension Kit and App Studio within the Unit4 ecosystem are more geared up to talking to REST APIs than they are to the original SOAP web services. So again, we're going to go through the actual publishing of these APIs. We'll do that through the management console. If you're running your own ERP7 environment on-premise or similar, this may have been done for you during an install. And if you're a managed cloud customer, again, this will probably already be done for you, but I'll go through anyway, just to provide an example of where these things are, how you set them up. We'll then actually go through calling some of these APIs, and we'll look at some differences between the structure of those from the web services through to the APIs. And then we'll also touch on the various operations you can perform from gets and posts through to an extra section on patching. So let's just jump straight into it, and we'll go into the management console again. And we're going to see that the web APIs are set up effectively in the same place as the web services were. So first off, we're going to log in with our super secure username and password. And once we're in, we're going to go into our features, the web applications, the default website, and you can see our web services is still published that we created previously. And we're going to go in here and we're going to add the public APIs this time. So the Unit4 ERP web API server. And again, I'm going to stick with the defaults as we go through, changing once again the HTTP to just HTTP rather than HTTPS, so I don't have to worry about certificates or anything like that. We hit the publish button, and there we go. That's created our web API. Now what I want to do just before we go any further on this one is check our application settings for the web API. And in here, the only thing that we want to do is make sure we've enabled Swagger and enabled the Swagger UI. These allow the Swagger UI, which we're going to use for a lot of our testing, to be published at the same time and provide us access to that. So I'll go through that when we're looking at it. We'll save that. And this should now all be up and running. Now, in the same way as we did with our web services, we're going to need to grant permissions to use the APIs. In this instance, whereas in our web services, we had the option to publish whichever web service we wanted to. So in this case, we only published the supplier web service. For the APIs, that option isn't there. They are all published for you. And there's a separate screen within the web client that allows you access to the API. So let's open that up. We'll go to our ERP7 login and wait for this to open. And this is, again, our login with our super secret details. And within here, we're going to look at the system admin area, the access control area, and the public API access. So this is where we're actually setting the access to these individual APIs. And here we can see them all published. So let's have a look at something like, I can't find the suppliers. That's one we're going to use mostly. Let's have a look at the supplier. And again, the old faithful system is there with access to that API. Now, as we discussed previously, do as I say, not as I do. You shouldn't really be providing full access to system users and the like within the APIs, because this often can be a security flaw. These APIs are published primarily to the outside world. In this instance, though, we're going to leave things as they are with the system user in place, so it's easier for us to test against. So let's come out of here. And let's head back into here. How do we actually find our APIs to use them now? Well, just like the web services had a test button that showed you the WSDL and provided you the information of where those web services lived. If we head over to the protocol and we hit test, it's going to open up our Swagger definition of these APIs. Now, Swagger allows us to test against these APIs to see what's available, check what data is accepted, actually run the endpoints, all without the need to install a third-party application like Postman. We will use Postman later to demonstrate how you gain access to these things through Postman, but you can do everything through Swagger. And many APIs that you interact with will have some sort of Swagger definition or similar published for you to get access to and test against without the need for any sort of external application. So what can we see in here? We've got a lot of APIs. As I said, the web services, we could choose which ones we wanted to post or show to the user. With the APIs, they're all available for you to look at. One thing to note is that with the web services, we saw that there were different versions that you could publish. So normally, as new versions are created later through the lifespan of the product, a new version with the name or its name dated will let you publish the latest versions. The APIs have the similar concept, but they tend to use version numbers. And what you'll see is up at the top here, we've got version 1 APIs and we've got version 2 APIs. Now let's have a look at the attributes endpoint. As you can see, we've only got one endpoint in here, which is get some attributes. We can't create any attributes. We can't deal with any attribute values because, again, we've got a get. If we look at version 2, though, and explore that definition, you'll see that there's attributes in here. And now we've got a post call, we've got a delete, we've got patches. So we've got much more functionality. What this means is that when this this API was originally released, there was only the ability to get attributes. As the time has progressed and Unit4 have added additional functionality, they've published version 2 editions of these APIs. They give additional functionality. So we're going to dive into that later to have a look at how we use those attributes. But for the moment, we're going to stick with the version 1s because we're going to go back to supplier or the supplier API. So looking at the same one that we were testing with the web services, but just the REST API version of it instead. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down the list and we're going to find our supplier API. I'm just still waiting for the Swagger page to load fully. This is being constructed in real time from a large Swagger definition document. And I'll actually show that to you later. But it does mean that when there's a lot of published APIs, it can take a little while to churn through all of that. So it's up and running again. So we got the supplier, and here you go. We can see we've got a post call. This allows you to create suppliers. We've got a delete call. And as I think I mentioned previously in the presentations, this delete call doesn't actually delete anything from the database. What it does and what it specifies here is that it sets the supplier to be status C or closed. And that happens a lot. There's a lot of data you can't delete in Unit4 ERP. So instead, the delete functions actually set them to closed. We've then got a get call to go and get a supplier from the system, and a patch call to update a supplier, along with a general object call, and we'll talk about the objects later, but this allows you to get a list of suppliers. So let's go ahead and let's get a supplier, and let's get the supply that we created in the web services, the SOAP web services demo. What you can see here is the first thing you get is the model definition. So this is what's going to be returned to you when you run the command. So you're going to see all of the detail that makes up that supplier. So payment information, contact points or addresses. You're going to get flexi field, custom field groups, relation values, everything like that. If we look at the actual model, this again is a bit like the WSDL. It's giving you further information of what these fields are, what the updated field is showing you. We're just going to stick here and we're going to say we want supplier 5001. So this is the SOAP web services supply that we created later. Let's hit the try it button, and it's going to prompt me for a username and password. And I'm simply going to log in with my system username and password in this instance. And there we go. We've got our supplier back. We've got all the information. We've got the supplier ID 5001. We've got the supplier name, SOAP test 5001. And we've got everything else that got set up during that process. So sort of dummy contact details and things like that. And we've also got custom field groups that have come through and relation values. So what else have we got here? We've got a response code. Now this is this is completely standard in REST APIs. You will get normal HTTP status codes returned to you for operations. What this means is that when you're making a call and you get something back, you don't actually need to check the data to see if something was wrong. You can check the response code. So you'll get the standard return code to come back. So 200 is an OK message in HTTP status codes. You might get a 201, which is a created message from the post call. And then you'll start getting error messages. So 404, for instance, that you might have seen when you go to websites and and a page is missing, you'll get 404. In the same way, in these REST APIs, if you were to request a supplier that doesn't exist, you'll get a 404 message. You might also get 422 messages, unprocessable. So if you send data that is incorrect and it can't decipher what you're asking for, you'll get a message. Or things like 401 or 403, which will be unauthorized messages. So if your user doesn't have permission. So let's also have a look at the request URL. So this is actually the URL endpoint that we called to get this information. And as you can see, we've got the starting point, which is our web API. We've got version 1, we've got suppliers, and then we've got the supplier ID. So it's a simple URL string to call a web API. But along with the supplier ID, which as we can see here is a path parameter, we can also accept a company ID, and this is of the type of query. As I mentioned before, I think I mentioned before, when you log in with your system user to this, it's going to take the default client assigned to that system user and use that for the calls. But what if we wanted to use something else? Maybe we've got access to multiple clients and we want to specify where this supplier is coming from because they're in a separate client to our default one. Well, company ID allows you to specify that client. So we can add EN to this, and in this case, adding EN, we're not going to see anything different in the results return, but you can now see we've got a question mark, company ID equals EN on the end of the URL. And this is because this is just a simple query parameter being added. Now, if we change this to something else, so XX in this instance, which is a company ID that doesn't exist in the system, we're going to get a 403, a user is not authorized. It didn't return to us and say actually company ID XX doesn't exist. What it's saying is your user doesn't have access to company XX in the system. And you might get those kind of things rather than telling you that something doesn't exist. It's actually checking to see whether you have access to it. You didn't, even though it's not there. So you get that kind of message. So there we go. Let's put our EN back. Let's try it out again. And we get our 200 code back again. Now what happens if we put in a random supplier ID? We'll try this out. And again, we get a nice message coming back. The entity wasn't found, but we don't need to rely on that. If we're doing a machine-to-machine communication here, so something like Extension Kit, going and grabbing suppliers, we don't need that to decipher a string to figure out what went wrong. All we're going to look at is the response code. I received back a 404, therefore the item that I was looking for wasn't found. Let's have a look at the attributes as well, because this will bring in our version 1s and our version 2s. So attributes, I can just run a simple get here, and you'll notice we've got lots of fields here. This is ODATA lookups we can perform here, and I'm going to talk about those later. But I can just run this as it is, and I'm going to get a list back of all of the attributes in the system. So what happens if we go to our version 2? Well, here we can actually specify the attribute ID. So in this instance, I'm going to go for C0, so resource numbers. So I get our attribute ID back, and you can see I can see the attribute name, I can see its attribute ID, I can see the category position or dim position, I can see whether it's an automatic or a manual, if it's open or closed, all those details. Let's have a look for attribute values. And in this case, we're going to do a get here. And notice that the attribute values is looking for an attribute details key. So rather than us having multiple paths where we're putting in the attribute ID and the value that we want, we have to give it more information than that. And in this case, it wants information within squared brackets. So we need to put in the attribute ID, C0, then we want the attribute value we're looking for. So I'll pick a resource that I know in the system. And also it's going to want the period from. And this is because you might have multiple attribute values that have changed from period to period. And it's not going to let you look up, just return all of them. It wants the specific one that you're looking for. So there we go, there's our details. We run that and we get Chris Smiley comes back, and we get custom field group information, any related values that are there. So you'll see that there's often different information that you have to provide to get the required result back. So what should we do now? Why don't we go and create a supplier in the same way that we did in the web services? So let's head back to our version 1. And what we're going to see here is when we were demoing this in the SOAP web services, what we did is we pre-prepared a lump of XML which had our supplier details to go and create something. And what I'm going to show you now is that the easiest way when we're doing REST APIs to go and create something is generally we go and get something first, we just copy that information and we post it back with our new values in. And it gives us a quick and easy way of creating a post request. So let's head down to our suppliers and let's go to the post. As you can see again, we get the model response. This is what we're going to receive back. And this is identical to the GET request. That may not always be true in the APIs you're looking at, but in the ERP APIs, that's generally what happens. You're posting in exactly what you would get back. And you'll notice that instead of parameter boxes like we had previously, it wants a bit of JSON here to actually create the supplier. And we've got our model along the side here, and we can click on this and Swagger will actually pre-populate that in. So why don't we just run this and see what happens? We've just stuck some JSON in there, and let's run it. We're going to try it, and what we're going to find is it's going to come back with an unauthorized. That's because the company ID is specified as string, and that's not a valid company in the system, so it thinks I don't have access to it. So let's change that to something we do have access to, EN, but leave everything else the same as it was. And what we've got is a 422. This means the JSON that you sent was unprocessable. It looks okay, but all of the values are a bit skew-if in here. We're just selling it strings and zeros and things like that. So how do we know what went wrong here? Well, within the ERP system, there's normally a notification messages bit of JSON that gets sent back to you. And that provides you with details of what went wrong with the request you were making. So if we look in this response body, we can see the last updated, it was fine with that. The invoice, okay, here we've got some problems. The payment method must be a string or an array with a maximum length of 2. And as you see, the payment method contains string. The tax filing requirement, again, must be a string with a maximum length of 1. It contains string. So these are the details that we're getting back, telling us what went wrong with the API. So if we want to be a bit smarter, if we're using this in an automated system, we could look for the response code. It comes back as something not 200 or not 201 in this case are created. It's a 422. So we could look through 4 notification messages and write those out to a log file to say these are the problems that I had. But that's just a quick example of how you actually run the post and what happens if you get errors. But we actually want to put something through now that's going to work. So again, the easiest way to do this is to go and grab one that's already in the system, and we'll use our previously created SOAP supplier and go and grab that. And we've got that back again. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this code. And I will come back into our post request and I'm going to paste it into here. Now there's some details in here that aren't required when we're doing a post. So we've got updated information, so last updated. these aren't valid when I'm doing a post because these are going to be set by the system when it actually creates this supplier. But it's not going to throw any errors if we send this information through. But let's change our supplier ID to 2, and we're going to change this to be API test. Okay, and let's try this out. So it's going to go away, it's going to think about it. As we said before, when you're posting something into the system, it normally takes a little longer to respond. And here we go, we got a 201, a created status code back, and it's created our supplier ID. So we can go back into our supplier ID lookup, change this to a 2, try it out, and we've got our API test. So we've proved that we can now create and go and get information. So what's next from this? We've created, we've gone and got information. Next, we're probably going to want to update these values. So what I'm going to do in the next session is I'm going to look at patches. Now, patches are a bit more in depth. They include various different operations you can do. So I'm going to split that out into its own little session, which is going to be shown next. So let's have a look at patching. Now, patching has its own structure to the patch calls. There's a JSON patch specification that you can look up online, which tells you what is allowed and how you structure a patch document. What you're going to see in these examples is we're going to be using the standard patch, but we're also going to be using some Unit4 specific patch code. And this is because there's some bits of looking up data and choosing which rows to update that is specific to Unit4 and isn't in the normal JSON patch standard. You won't come across this very often where a supplier of a product has changed how a patch works, but in the case of the Unit4, they've made some adjustments to it. So let's have a look at the patch. Again, the model we're going to get back is the same as we did if we were doing a GET call. So what's going to happen is you're going to send in a patch and it's going to send you back the updated model. We have to provide a supplier ID. So let's add the supplier ID that we've just created. And let's have a look at the first patch we're going to use. And in this instance, I'm going to just update the supplier name that comes back. So here you go. Here's our patch document. Let's have a little chat about the structure of this. It's an array, so it starts with square brackets. This is because we can actually provide multiple patch operations in one call. So we could update multiple fields if we wanted. Within the patch object itself, we have a path. This is telling us what field in the data we're going to be updating with this. The / is the root of the object. So if we scroll to the top, these first items are at the root of the supplier object. And we're going to patch supplier name. These names are case sensitive when you're doing these operations. The JSON is case sensitive. So we're going to say, starting at the root, we're going to patch supplier name. OP, this is the operation we're going to perform. In this case, we're going to do a replace. There are other operations that you can run in a patch. There's an add if you're wanting to add something that doesn't exist. There's a remove if you want to remove a value. And there's even move and copy if you want to move data from one field to another. In general, I tend to just use replace and add because you're normally updating data that's already there. But you may come across some of the others and use those. And finally, the value. So this is what we're changing it to. So at the moment, our supplier that we created is called API test 5002. We're going to add UPD on the end to specify that we've updated this. So again, let's try this out and make sure we got a 200 back. We got an OK. And if we scroll down, our supplier name now reads API test 5002 update. And just to be pedantic, we can head back in and we can run our GET request. And we can see, yes, indeed, that's been updated in the database. Now, when you're doing this yourself, including creating and updating, things might not be as immediate for you because you may have things in place like workflow, which are going to pick up the creation of a supplier and send it through to approval, and do the same for updates and things like that. In my case, in this local environment, I've not got workflow on my supplier record, so I'm not getting into anything like that. But what if you want to do more than that? What if there's something lower down in the list that you want to change? So for instance, let's have a look at our custom field groups that we've got. And I've got a S field test, which is a single field group, flexi field, and a T field test, which is a table flexi group attached to our customers, attached to our supplier. And you can see that these are within the custom field groups area. So what if I want to make some changes to these? What if I want to change text field 1 to something else, for instance? Let's head back to our patch and let's go and grab a patch document that I've already prepared and put this in. So the path, you can see, is different this time. We're specifying that we've got the root of the object and we want to go into the custom field groups, then into the S field test custom field group, and then the text field 1 actual field on that flexi field group. After that, the details are still the same. The operation is replace, and we're going to replace it with patched value. So this is showing our path changes that we have to make to go down the list and specify where we actually want to make this change. So let's run this. And again, we get a 200 back. So there we go. We check our S field test and we've got our new patched value in there. What about rows? You'll notice that in our patch document here, we were directly specifying a field to patch. But of course, in a row or a flexi field group or relation values, there's multiple entries. So we need to provide details of how to get to the entry we want to replace. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some rows because our table field group doesn't contain anything at the moment. We know it's a table field group because we've got square brackets. It's an array. So it's going to have an array of objects in there, much like the related values, which has a cost center and a supplier group. This is an array with relation value objects on it. The same for our custom field group. So we want to add one of these. So let's go and grab this example. And I'm going to paste this in. And here we go. So we've got our path and we're saying custom field groups, T field test, and then we've got a minus sign. And this is basically saying if we were updating values in there for a specific row, we might actually give a number, but because we're adding a new item and that doesn't have an ID or anything like that at the moment, we're using this minus sign to say this is an addition to a table. Again, we're using an operation of add, and we're specifying the two fields within that table that we're going to add values to. Now, I know that there's a field 1fx and a field 2fx in there. When you get the data back, if there's nothing in there, you're not going to get those details. So when you're dealing with a FlexiField group and attached to something within ERP, you're probably going to need to know in advance what the fields are called. But here we go. We're going to add a new entry using a patch document to there. So let's run this. And again, 200 back, looking good. We've got our updates working fine. And if we scroll down, we've now got a row ID of 0 with a patch add 1 and patch add 2. If we increase these numbers and run it again, we get our 200. And now we've got two rows in there, row ID 0 and row ID 1. Now these are the details that we're going to need, 0 and 1, because if we want to then go ahead and update those values, we're going to need to know where to find them. And for custom field groups or table flexi field groups attached, we need to know their row ID, and that row ID is basically the line number or the sequence number. So let's first have a look at standard patch notation, because this is where Unit4 offers some additional functionality that you don't find in the standard patch. But if we want to update this with normal patch notation, I've got an example here. And what you can see is we're going to go into our custom field groups, our T field test, and we're going to specify the array number, so the index of the array where we want to make our change, and we're going to look at field 1fx, and we're going to replace it with a u on the end, or just replace the value. So at the moment, that entry is patch add 1. That's what we're going to update, and we're again specifying directly within the path the index in the array that we want to change. We run this again, we get a 200, and if we go down, we can see the change to our patch. We've got this U on the end. So that correctly identified the row ID that we wanted to change. But this isn't always the case. If we were patching relation values, for instance, they don't necessarily have a row ID. Or in some cases they do, but we probably want to specify based on the attribute ID, because we don't know which row or which array index that's going to be. And that's where Unit4 have introduced two new functions, replace by ID and add or replace by ID. So let's have a look at replace by ID first, because we're going to use that for this flexi field group. I've got a version here. And here we go. So the path, all we're doing for the path is we're specifying the flexi field group that we want to patch. So T field test. We're not going to giving it an index value or anything like that. We're going to give that in a second. We're just specifying the path to that flexi field group is this. We've then got this replace by ID. As I say, this is a custom Unit4 operation. And within our value, we now provide a row ID of 0. And this is telling this replace by ID operation exactly where the data is that we want to change. So let's run this. We get our 200 again. And if we scroll down, the correct field is updated. We could run that for the row ID 1 as well. And try that out. And again, we update that value. So here's a custom specific operation that we're using, a Unit4 custom operation that we're using to update these things. What about relation values? We've got here cost centers on the system, and we don't have any row ID changed, returned. So what are we using for our updates? For relation values, we're going to be using the relation ID, because this is going to give us the index to look up and change. But just to add a little bit of confusion, when we're patching relation values, we're going to be using the add or replace by ID. The reason being, if we were to use just the replace by ID, it's going to fail. And actually, I'll show you that. So let's copy in our add or replace by ID. And we're going to be changing C1 to 210. So let's run this. We get our 200 back. And you can see that our cost center has changed to 210. Now, if we were to change this to do replace by ID, which is what we used previously for the custom field groups. And we say try to change this back to 100. So now we've got the path of related values, the operation of replace by ID, and the relation ID of C1. Let's try this out again. And we're getting an error. This operation is not supported. So even though it worked for custom field groups, replace by ID doesn't work for related values. So we're needing to use add or replace. And if we try this again, now we get our 200. Now we get the relation value updated. So there's a little bit of trial and error with patches, especially when you're dealing with Unit 4, where there's custom operations specific to the Unit 4 ERP platform. You may have to do a little bit of jiggery-pokery to get this stuff working. But we've seen a few examples here of the various add calls, replace calls, and add or replace that you should be able to move on with. The key thing about patches are you've got a path which gives you where you're going to make your update. You've got an operation which tells the patch what it's actually doing, and then you've got the values that you're replacing. As I mentioned previously, this is an array, so we can make multiple updates if we want. So let's grab a multiple update patch here. And here you can see I'm updating my T field test again, and I'm changing row ID 0 to be field 1 to be multi. And at the same time, I've got one patch object, I've got a comma, and then I've got another patch object here, all contained in the array. And this one's going to update, add or replace by ID, the cost center again. So we try this out and we get a 200. So we can scroll down and we can see, yes, our table section updated to multi, and then our cost center updated to 210 as well. So we're able to issue multiple calls in one go when we're doing patches. So this is really useful for making multiple updates at the same time. We don't have to send one patch, then another patch, then another patch. We can string them all together and we can make multiple ones at the same time. And that's about it for patches. There can be a bit of confusion about what you're doing if you're dealing with arrays, if you're dealing with just single fields, if you're dealing with relation values or your custom field groups. They all need slightly different ways of patching. But fundamentally, the structure of the patch document is the same. You're providing a path to the item that you want to change, the operation you want to perform on that item, and then some value information, which in the case of an add or replace is multiple values to provide the lookup. But when you're doing just a replace, for instance, you're just giving the value that you want to put in there, like we did with the supplier name. So that's it. That's patches in a nutshell. In the previous look at these APIs, and when we've been testing against an ERP7 environment, we've been using basic authentication. So we've been providing a username and a password. Behind the scenes, what is happening with this is that username and password are being joined together into a string, encoded as base 64, and sent through within the authentication header of the request. And that is then decoded and used to do the actual authentication to provide access to an API. And that's a very standard way of doing things. Another way, which you'll likely come across fairly regularly, and especially if you're using something like ERPX, is token authentication. And this is where you go and get a token from an identity provider and you send that through with your request for the lookup instead. And this is actually shown in ERPX. So I've got an ERPX Swagger UI running here, and you'll see that this is very similar to the ERP7 APIs that we were looking at previously. In ERPX, there's actually a few more APIs as there's additional functionality provided. But let's look at our old faithful supplier API, as that's the one we've used a lot so far. Head on over to supplier. We've got the same calls in here. We've got a get supplier. But you can see we've got an additional field now, an authorization field, which accepts an access token. and this is going to go through in the header. So what do we do here? How do we get a token and provide that along with the call? Well, what you'll do is you'll actually issue, or what you'll do in general is you'll issue a call to another API, normally hosted by the identity server. So in this case, Unit4's IDS has a token endpoint that you can request a token from. So I'll demonstrate that now just to give you an idea of how we do this in ERPX. And for that, we're going to use Postman. So we haven't used Postman so far to look at APIs. We've been using solely Swagger. But let's have a look in Postman and see how we do this. And this is going to lead on to actually using Postman for other REST API calls. So let's have a look at our ERPX, and let's have a look at the IDS token. This is the structure in Postman for sending a request to an API. We've got a post request. These kind of token requests are always post because they're actually doing something in the database. They're creating a token for you to use. So you're not just getting a token that already exists, you're creating one then and there. So we've got the URL for our token, the token endpoint, and then we're sending several values through in the body. We're choosing this X www form URL encoded. This means that these will actually be sent through in the URL when it sends the details through. We need a client ID and a secret. Within Postman, I'm storing these in within parameter values, but you will be given these by your identity services provider. So Unit4 would be able to give you these details. And if you're calling another system, if you're calling something like the Microsoft Graph as part of your Azure environment, your Microsoft 365 clients, you can get your client ID and secret from Azure and things like that. We've got a scope, in this case, U4 ERP, and the grant type is client credentials. So these are specific to requesting a token for ERPX. If you're doing this for an external system, you may have slightly different values in the scope and the grant type and things like that. But the structure will be similar. So let's do this. Let's send this request through. And here we go. We've got an access token back. We've got an expiry. So this is the time this token will live for. This is probably in seconds. The token type is bearer. Most JWT tokens are bearer tokens, and the scope is U4 ERP. So let's see how we use this within our authorization call. If I was to make the call with nothing in here, so I know there's a supplier in here 3001, and I try this call, I get a 400, I get a no content because I'm not authorized to do this. Let's grab our token. Let's head back to Swagger and let's put this in the authorization area. Now we can't just post a token in, we have to specify that it's a bearer token. So we type in bearer, put a space in, and then we paste in our token. We hit the try it out button again, and this time we return the value. So here you go. Here's our Tech4 supplier within our ERPX environment. And the same things are returned as we saw when we were running this on ERP7. We've got the supplier details, we've got invoice and payment details, we've got contact points, and we've got relation values and the like. So this is just showing you token authentication within Swagger. Now, depending on the Swagger version, you might input this in a different place. Quite often at the top of the Swagger page, there will be a login button where you can provide a token. But in general, for ERPX, and if you're using this in ERP7 with IDS attached, there's an authorization field that you will put these details in. But what about within Postman itself? What if we want to do a get supplier within Postman using this token? Well, I've got a get supplier call set up here. As you can see, I'm passing in a company ID via the parameters, and I've also set the URL to be 3001. So if we looked at our request that we made here, we've got the endpoint that I'm requesting. So all I've done is copy and pasted this into our URI in Swagger, and then it's added the company ID onto that. Now we've got an authorization tab here, and you can see that we can set this to type of bearer. If I was calling an ERP7 environment, I would just choose basic authentication, and I'd put in my super secret system, my username and password for ERP7. But for ERPX, I'm using a bearer token. In this instance, because it knows it's a bearer token, I don't need the bearer at the start of it. It's going to put that in first itself. So we go back to this token that we got previously. We'll copy this and we'll put this into our new call, and we'll send this request. And there you go. Within Postman, we've now returned our data again. So it's for our 3001 Tech4 consulting supplier. So that's just a little bit of information on token authentication when it comes to APIs. Now you'll see this in Extension Kit if we're making calls in there, because what you can do is within the call itself, there is an option to specify that you want to get a token first, and Extension Kit will actually deal with the request for that token, grabbing that token and then adding it into the request when it makes it to the API. And we might show that later when we do a very quick Extension Kit demo. But for the moment, that's the two different types of authentication you will generally come across: basic authentication and token authentication. Out in external API world, you might also see things like certificate authentication, but they're difficult for me to demo. So they are accommodated in things like Extension Kit, where there is options for certificate authentication, but they're handled slightly differently. Commonplace is token authentication and basic authentication. So far we've had a look at making our get calls, post calls, and all those kind of things against our ERP7 environment via the Swagger user interface that is published when you publish the web APIs, or if you choose to publish it. We've also had a quick look in ERPX at the Swagger UI there, and also done a quick access of that through Postman. But let's have a little more in-depth look at Postman and see how we can get to all our API calls and make them through there. When we looked at Postman with web services, with our SOAP web services, we imported a WSDL, and that created all our calls for us. So they were all ready to go for us. We can do the same thing using our Swagger UI here. And what you see is that where we choose which version we're going to look at, all this is doing is pointing to where our Swagger documentation actually is. And this is basically the OpenAI specification for our APIs. And that's what this Swagger user interface uses to generate this page and allow access to all of these items. So we can actually go directly to this location because this provides us with the URL of documentation Swagger v1. So let's put this into the address bar. So documentation Swagger v1. And let's go here. And this is going to take a little while to load because this is actually quite a large document that's going to come back. But here it is. This is the OpenAI specification for the APIs that are published via our ERP7 environment. And this is not very human readable. You can probably pick out bits of information. You can get the URLs and the definitions and things like that. And you could actually look into this and get the only information yourself. But really you use this with another tool. And we're going to use this in the same way that we used our WSDL for creating calls within SOAP UI and also within Postman. But we're going to use it purely in Postman this time. So let's take a copy of this URL. And let's open up Postman. And in the same way that we imported the WSDL, which gave us our SOAP calls that we could make, which are still here, we can use the import call again and paste in the URL that we just got our OpenAI definition from. And again, this takes a little while for it to churn through because it's quite a big document. But again, you can see it's found the collection. So we'll hit import. And what this is going to do is give us all of the calls that we could see in the Swagger user interface, but via Postman now, so that we can now make these calls via that. So again, it's going to take a little while to churn through all that information and build up all these calls. But we're going to have now quite a similar experience. Although I'm going to show you the things that I necessarily don't like when you do this via Postman. You could create all these calls yourself manually, and that's what I've done with our ERPX calls. So when I was demonstrating going and getting an IDS token and getting a supplier there, those are calls I've created myself. But this does give you a bit of a head start. So we can jump into this documentation that's just been created, and we can find our trusty suppliers API. And if we open that, we can see that we've got our post call that runs on the root of the supplier API. But then if you provide a supplier ID, you get access to the get call, the delete call, and the patch call at that stage. One thing I'm going to do here is all of these calls are set to inherit their authentication from the parent object, which is this web API documentation. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to put our system user into the authorization here, so I don't have to write it multiple times. So we click on the authorization tab, we choose basic authentication. If I was doing this for ERPX, I could use the bearer token that we looked at getting in one of the previous sessions. But in this case, I'm going to use basic auth. And this is going to ask me for a username and password. So let's put in our super secure details of system and system, and let's save that. And now what that means is that when I come to actually issue recall, normal calls, so the get call, if we look at the authorization here, it's saying inherit authorization from its parent, and you can see this request is using basic auth from the collection. So I don't need to put in the system on all of the different calls. But I've got my get call here. If I look at the parameters, you can see that we've got a company ID, which is set as string at the moment. We want this to be EN, and then we've got a supplier ID, which is this value here. So let's put in the supplier that we actually created in the previous session. And now let's send that request. Let's run this GET request. So this is now going to my local ERP7 environment. And as we see before, we get our 200 response code back, and we get all of the details we were getting through Swagger. So we very quickly and easily created an interface where we can now test all of our API calls in the way that we've done with our supplier calls. With these details, we might not want to send the company ID through, as we specified earlier. This is something that it's going to get from our default client, so we don't necessarily need this unless we're looking for something in a separate client. So I can turn this one off, and I can issue the call again, and it's going to send that request, and it gets the request again, so I get a 200 back. I just am not sending the supplier ID. So let's grab this supplier, because we're going to now try and post and create a new supplier through Postman. So I'm going to quickly copy this, and let's head on over to our post call to have a look at this. And what you'll see is it's looked at the definition for the post. So it's looked at all of the objects that are required, and it's added them into this form URL encoded. So it's taken the details from the schema definition of what these are, whether they're required or not, and it's giving us a value to populate. Now for small calls, if we're creating something simple in the system which only has a few fields, this is dead easy. I can input the details in here and quickly make that call. But for something like creating a supplier, we saw in Swagger that it was easier, like we've done here, to run a get call to get a value first, get all the information, and then use that call slightly edited in our post. But I can't do that here because I've got to enter all these details. So what do? Well, the easiest thing that we do, and this is how I run most of my calls through Postman, is in the body section, the body tab. I'm going to set this to be raw, and then I'm going to set the text value to JSON. And this is therefore going to send JSON through in the body. With the URL encoded, what it's going to do is it's going to take these values that I put in here and encode them into JSON and send them through for me. But by going to the raw and the JSON and doing it myself, I'm skipping over that part and making it easier. The only other thing I will need to do is within the headers, it's telling me what the content type is that I'm going to send through. So these headers are basically details that you don't often see, especially not through Swagger, because this is all handled behind the scenes for you. But in Postman, you have access to be able to tweak these headers. And that's useful because if you're dealing with external APIs, they might actually require you to send additional details through in the header. So you can manipulate them here. In the case of the Unit4 ERP APIs, they don't require anything else. So what we can do is we've got to, this time, instead of this www format URL encoded, which we decided we're not going to use, we're just going to change this to JSON, just so that it picks up correctly from the body. And now let's paste in all the details that we stole from our 5002. And let's go and change this. Let's make this 5003. And let's take the update off the N and let's send this through. And hopefully this is going to go off and create yet another supplier in our ERP7 environment. And as you can see, we got a 201 created back again. So we've created our supplier. And indeed, we can head back into here. We can change this to free. We can send it through. And hopefully, there it is. We've got our call back again. So you can do everything within Postman that you can do through the Swagger definition that we've been looking at previously. We can do things in the patch and things, for instance. And actually, what it's doing is Postman is generating us. So for patches, for instance, it's generating us some nice examples to get going with. So you can see the patch is providing us with a path and operation that we can start putting our details into. But everything remains the same. We're just looking at a different interface. What we're not going to cover here regarding Postman is the ability to mock up calls and things like that. There's a lot of functionality that Postman can give you for testing your APIs, for developing your APIs, which are kind of outside of the scope of this course. I just want to give a basic introduction to the tools you can use and the data structures you can use to get that information back. One of the interesting things we said, because we've got access to the header and things, so for example, in this get call, I said we can see the headers. One of the things I noted when we were talking about the token authentication and the basic authentication is the way it sends things through in authorization. And I mentioned within that discussion that when you use basic authentication, what is basically happening is it's taking that username and password and it's encoding it into a base 64 string. And we can actually see that here. So we've got basic and then we've got a base 64 encoded string. So this is your user details. So if we actually copy this and we head over to the web, I've got a base 64 decode tool here. So if I actually paste those details in, it will decode it to system and system. So this might worry you. You might be thinking, am I just sending, although it's encoded as base 64, if someone intercepted this, they could actually decode my username and password. That isn't the case. Running on my local environment, it possibly is, because we're running in HTTP, so therefore my requests are all unprotected. But when you're using HTTPS, which you will be in all situations against production environments, this header information is basically protected and encrypted in transit, so people can't just look at this. But it's an interesting thing to see. If we were to go back to our ERPX calls, where we talked about sending token authentication through, and we looked at our headers, you can see we've got the bearer token in here. And this is what's allowing us access to our ERPX environment. And actually, this again is a base 64 encoded string. So we could copy this, and there's actually a site called jwt.io. And if we go to this site, we can actually paste in that token that we got from ERPX and see what the details are in it. So we've got all our details here, with its signatures and things like that. Now again, that kind of information is going to be protected when you're actually making your calls yourself to the environment. But it's a useful thing to see. Via Postman, we're getting more access to the other settings that are required to actually make API calls. And if you're calling from, say for instance, you're creating a .NET process, or you're building your own process, you will be setting these header values yourself. So this allows you to, through Postman, you can tinker with these values as you want. But that's pretty much it. We've loaded in effectively our WSDL that we had for web services, but in this case it was an OpenAI specification. That has created all our calls in Postman, and they're then available for us to use. And we are sending data and returning data in exactly the same way as we were within Swagger. It's just another way of doing it. So far in everything we've been looking at, we've been just making standard API calls, so standard GET calls, where we're providing a supplier ID or something similar, and we're getting a result back. One thing I want to cover as well, and these are used throughout the system, especially in Unit4 ERP, are ODATA calls, and these are again GET requests. But you're able to tailor the data that you're getting and how it's being looked up. And these are normally found within the objects within the system. So if we were to look at, for example, this is our ERPX environment. If you head down to objects, there's a raft of objects that you can make queries to that provide extra details that are maybe an amalgamation of information, or that there isn't another sort of standard API call for. Now these are really useful because you can basically tailor these to get only the information that you actually need at the time. And they're also exposed via report engine through the AGR object call. So if you're making a report engine document and you're using the APIs within that to get data, you'll be making AGR object calls and providing OData lookup information. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at this now, and we're going to jump between Swagger and our Postman environment, and we're going to do this in ERPX as well. So let's have a look at purchase orders as a starting point. So we'll scroll down our list. As you can see, there's a lot of APIs in here, or a lot of objects that we can look at. And in ERP7, if you look in your user-defined object screen, which is available in the web client, you can actually create your own object, maybe pointing at a view, database view that you've created, or some other table combination, and those can be exposed as available through the API, and they'll appear in this list. But let's have a look down and let's go and find the purchase orders object, which is just down here, purchase orders. And the first thing we notice is there's a warning against this. So this object version has been deprecated. We spoke in the first session about APIs, about the versioning of APIs, and that some APIs may be deprecated and modified in the future. So this is one of them. Purchase orders, there's a version 1 object, but that has been deprecated. It's still available for you to use. So if you've created an interface or you've created some customization that is using this object, this version 1 object, it will still be functional. But what they're saying is it's been deprecated. Use the newer version instead, because that may be more reliable. It may return additional information. This means that when you're actually building your interfaces, you're given a bit of time to change. So if you're doing an upgrade of your system, for instance, and some of your APIs have been deprecated, you don't have to immediately change to the new ones. You can do your upgrade, still point at the old ones, and then at some other point make your change when that new functionality is required. So let's have a look at this. We know this one's deprecated, so let's go and find the new one. So let's choose our version 2 and go and explore this one in Swagger. And if we have a look in our objects, sure enough, there's a version 2 purchase orders object. And what we're going to get is, if we actually just run this, we'll get a 400 because we need our bearer token. So let's fire up Postman and we go and get a token like we've done previously. So we've got our IDS token call ready. I'm going to make that and I'm going to grab this token. Let's head back to Swagger, and within our authorization field, we put in bearer, and then we're going to paste in our token. We make this call again, and what it's going to do is it's going to take a little while because it's going to get a lot of information, but we get our purchase orders back. And as we can see, there's a lot of them, and we get a lot of information back again. So this is where the OData calls really come into their own. We can actually tailor what information we're getting back when we're actually making these calls. And we do that with the various parameters we can set. Now, when you're looking at this, one of the confusions is what options are available to you in OData. We're only going to scratch the surface in this session and see some initial things. But one of the important things to note is that I believe the Unit4 ERP APIs and their OData implementation is based on OData version 2. There's a OData version 4 already out there in the wild, and if you're looking up documentation on how to make OData queries, a lot of that information you get back may already be specifying OData version 4. So you'll get commands in there that you'll try and run in these lookups that won't work. You'll just get errors back. So when you're looking for these things, make sure that you're looking for OData version 2 and using the calls available to you there. I don't know if this is getting upgraded at any point, but this is our sort of starting point. And what can we do here? Well, the most important ones for us really are the select and the filter, because these allow us to tailor what we're returning back again. So if we look at this data structure again, like we saw in the supplier calls, we've got a lot of fields that we can return back again. But say we just want, I don't know, maybe the supplier ID and the order number. We can get those details. So in our select call, we can simply type in supplier ID, put in a comma, and type in order number. Let's do that correctly. And here we're telling our OData query, I just want these two fields returned, nothing else. So let's try that again. And there we go. We get a much smaller data set come back. It's not particularly useful to us, but if we wanted to get all our orders and the suppliers they were for, there it is. That's all the information we want. It responded a lot quicker this time because the data we're getting back is much smaller. We can take this further though. We can actually decide which suppliers we want to return. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hop on over to Postman to do this in there to show you that we've got the same options available there. So let's go to a mock-up purchase orders OData I've set up here. And let me just paste in my token that I've just retrieved so that it's up to date. And let's have a look at our parameters. And you can see in the same way as I was doing here, where I was adjusting the select to say I want supplier ID and order number, I'm doing exactly the same here as well. I'm getting the supplier ID, I'm getting a transaction number, order number, and various other fields. What you will see with this though, is what happens if I want a field that's within a sub-object. So the order buyer information is an object itself with fields in, which also contains a supplier object with fields in. Well, if we look at this select clause that we've got in here, so what we're saying here is that we're going to get our supplier ID, our transaction number, but we also just want our order line information, which is one of the objects within there, and we just want these fields from it. In addition to that, we've got our filter, and we saw our filter here, but we haven't put anything in here. And basically we're saying where the supplier ID is equal to 3009, that's saying I just want the items for that supplier. So if we send this through, we're going to get supplier 3009 information, and our order line information has just got those fields that we wanted. So again, a lot less data here, and it allows you to write your own queries and only return the data that you actually need. So if you're using, say, an external Power BI dashboard or some other reporting tool, you can tailor your request to only get the information you want. So as a brief look, that's the basics of the OData. You're providing a list of fields that you want to return, unless of course you want to return all of them, and then you're filtering, and you can make multiple filters. So we could say where supplier ID is equal to 3009, and maybe we'll check on the order number as well. So we can say and order number is equal to 10,000. And let's send that again. And you can see we've only got one entry now. There's various other commands you can say. So we could say we want this to be greater than or equal to, which will be GE. And let's add a 1 to this so it moves out this order number. And there you go. So now we've got orders for that supplier where the order number was greater than or equal to 10,001. And that's it. In a nutshell, that's your selecting and your filtering through OData. And as I say, there's numerous calls you can make, numerous objects that are available to you to get information from. So these really are there to be used within reporting, external reporting, report engine reports in ERPX, and also in ERP7. They're very useful for returning exactly the data you want and only that data. So predominantly throughout this course, we've been looking at the Unit4 ERP APIs, mainly because that's the core ones that I'm aiming at in follow-on courses. But what if we want to look at some external APIs? How easy is it to access something like that and start making calls against it? Well, it turns out it's pretty easy. Generally, you'll be sent the details of the endpoints, and then you'll be able to use something like Postman to start querying those endpoints straight away. So let's have a quick example of that. I know online I found a countries API, and this is just a free API hosted on the web that you can go and use yourself. So if I have a look at this and look at the endpoints to it, there's various endpoints that I can call. I can get all the countries. I can get a country by its name. So how easy is that for me to use? Well, let's fire up Postman and let's have a go. We'll load this up. And then we'll have a look in our external API calls and we'll create a new request. So add a request. And in here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of these endpoints and I'm going to paste it in here and submit it. And there we go. We've called an API and we've got loads of details back again. Now we probably want to restrict those details, and we can do the same kind of things as we were doing previously. So let's have a look at this by name. I can see that there's a name call and I can provide a name to it. So again, let's copy that. Let's paste it in and let's choose a country, say France, for instance. Send that out. And I've gone and got all the details for France. And again, the structures are exactly the same as we've been looking at with the ERP APIs. I'm getting an array of details back. I get the name. This is an object, and it gives me some information. It gives me some currencies and capitals and all things like that. So through Postman, it's simple to call our ERP APIs. It's simple to call external APIs. And you'll be doing the same thing if you're using something like Extension Kit. You might be mixing and matching data between ERP APIs and external APIs, in which case you'll be making calls out to those that are hosted somewhere else or hosted by yourself. And all you'll do is you'll get a definition, like the Swagger definition we saw in ERPX. This is slightly different. They're just listing the endpoints we can have a look at. So again, currencies. We can grab that. We can copy a currency information in here. And we can run that and get the information for that currency. Now I assume that I could use GBP. And I'm getting the information for that currency. So everything is available that you would have had through ERP through any other API. And you can use Postman to run those tests quickly and simply. What about GraphQL? I've mentioned this a couple of times through the process and I said we'd have a very quick look at it. And basically, it is again an API endpoint, but it's used predominantly for querying APIs. So being more tailored about what data you're going to bring back. And again, for this, I found a countries GraphQL API that we can call. So I've got the address of it here, and you'll notice with GraphQL that you're just doing a post call. With GraphQL, there's always a schema that comes with it, which tells you all the fields you can use. And Postman can pick up on this. So by putting in the location of this API, this GraphQL API, Postman's actually fetched the schema, and we can refresh it if we want. So it knows what is available there for us to use. So we can start typing and actually Postman will do some auto completion for us. So within this API, I know I can go and get details about countries. So let's have a look at that country call. All GraphQL queries are within curly brackets. And let's start typing countries. And here you go. You can see that Postman has gone off, it's got our schema, and it's already returning the details for us so that we can actually start auto-completing some information. So let's have a look at the countries. We know that this countries is going to be an object, and it's going to have some data that it's going to bring back. If we were to try and run this on its own, it's going to complain because actually you haven't provided what data you want. Within GraphQL, there is no just give me everything call. You have to always be specific about what field you want to return. So unlike APIs that we've looked at in ERP7 or in ERPX, where we're getting all the data we require straight away, and then we might use OData to reduce that amount, with GraphQL it's different. You're not getting any data unless you specifically ask for it. So for countries, I'm guessing there's a name of the country. And there we go. And I also probably think there's probably a capital. So we'll choose that. And we'll also go and get the currency. So let's run this. And you can see we've now got our list of countries with their capitals and their currency. So that's great. What is some of the power that GraphQL gives you? Well, it allows you to do complex filtering of the results you get back. So like we saw in OData, where we were choosing purchase orders and we were specifying where the supplier ID equals something, we can do similar within GraphQL calls. So in this instance, they provide you with a filter. So here you can see it auto-completing for us. We've got a filter. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, what we want are where all the countries where the currency is equal to GBP. So again, we're starting to type currency. And then just like OData, we can start building our comparison here. So we're going to do equals. And now we're going to specify specifically GBP. And there we go. We haven't done anything else with our list. We've now applied a filter to it. And there we go. So we've run our GraphQL query and we've got our list of all the countries that include GBP. Now there's other calls that can be made here. We saw that when we were auto-completing the countries, there were some other options in there. So let's have a look at continents. And again, we'll go and get the name and maybe the code of this continent. So there, we were first asking for countries and getting the details of countries. Now we're asking for continents and getting those details back. Now this is all well and good, but does it really give us anything that we didn't have within the REST APIs? Well, yes, it does. GraphQL allows us to explicitly specify what information we want back, and that includes joining queries together. So previously, when we were looking at our objects within ERP, we were going and specifically getting purchase orders. If we wanted to also get information about the supplier that's associated with that purchase order, that would have to be a completely separate call to the supplier API. So if we were building that in something like Extension Kit, we would wait one call to get the purchase order. We would then make a second call to get the supplier that is associated with that purchase order. So 2 API calls. And the trouble with APIs is the more calls you make, the more delay you get. Each call is a separate call out across the internet to something and getting data back. In GraphQL, we can make those calls in one go. So here, our first call was to get country information and our second call was to get continents. We can now make those calls at the same time. So if I reinstate my countries query, and I'm going to paste this in to save me typing it out again. Here you go. You can see that the first query is getting countries with GBP. The second query is getting continents with the name and the code. And if we execute this query, we're getting the results to both of those in one go. And we can keep going. So the continents themselves, they also contain a list of countries that are within them. So let's see if we can get hold of that information. Here we go, countries. And again, with GraphQL, you always have to specify what you're getting. We know that countries is an object in this case, so we need to say what we want, and we're just going to say name. And now executing this, we're still getting our list of GBP countries, but now we're getting our list of continents, and with each continent, we're getting the list of countries with it. So this is really powerful. GraphQL is basically a query language, much like something like SQL, which sits on top of the APIs and lets you be very specific about what data you want to return from those APIs. You won't come across GraphQL very much. Most organizations, when they're publishing APIs for their systems, they're only publishing REST APIs, simple REST APIs, like we've looked at with ERP7 and ERPX. But you may come across organizations that are posting GraphQL queries. So you can see in Postman, they're basically accessed in the same way as we were accessing other APIs, but in this case, the syntax is slightly different, and we're able to much more tailor the information you want. I could get more in depth into this. It's very complicated, but we're going to keep it simple and leave it there for the moment. If you look up GraphQL online, there's lots of information about what it is, how you use it, and I would suggest starting there. So we've looked at interacting with the APIs via Swagger on ERP7. We've looked at it through Swagger on ERPX, and we've looked at it through using Postman as well, and that's been connecting to external APIs and even GraphQL APIs at the same time. If you're a Unit4 customer, one of the main places you might end up using APIs is within Unit4's Extension Kit. So let's have a very quick look at how you might connect to and call an API through Extension Kit. So here we are, we're creating a new flow, and we're just going to set this to trigger via a webhook. And this means it will basically be available online for us to call. So we will be able to call it through Postman if we want to. And we're just going to call this supplier hook, because we're going to hook into the supplier API. Authentication is the authentication to actually call this webhook. We could connect it up to our IDS or allow for basic authentication. I'm just going to choose none for the moment so that I can just easily call it. We're going to give it a quick name as well, or it won't run. And then we'll go through to our action. So within the actions, the HTTP request is the part of the action where we will actually make that call to the API. So if we choose that as our action, and in here, we're going to choose bearer authentication, because what we're going to be doing is connecting to our ERPX environment and calling that. And if you remember, that requires token authentication. So if we choose bearer, we're given the details that we would see in Postman. So if we hop back into Postman and look at where we request our ERPX token, we're asked for client ID, client secret, and the scope of what we're asking for. And that generates us a token. Extension Kit takes care of all of that for us. So for the token endpoint, I've already added some of these details in as parameters. So I've created an ERPX IDS parameter, and that's basically this address. And then similarly, I've got a IDS client, and I've got a secret, and then the scope as well that I want to use in this request. So next up, or what I should say first, is that ERPX or Extension Kit in this example is going to take care of going and asking for a token and then feeding that token through to the subsequent request that I'm going to make to the APIs. So what am I going to do? I'm going to hop back to our usual supplier endpoint and go and get information about a supplier. So in this instance, I'm going to make a GET call because I'm not updating anything, I'm just getting the information back. And for the URL, Extension Kit now has built into it the locations of your APIs. So Unit4 ERP and the web API on there. What I need to do though is complete the rest of the URI to get my endpoint. So what I'm looking for is the V1 and then the supplier's endpoint. And because I've only got one supplier that I'm actually interested in, the 3001 supplier, which is my Tech4 consulting supplier, I'm going to hard code that in. But I may have brought that information in from the webhook itself. When you're creating a webhook, you can set the request body and you could say, well, within some JSON in here, I'm going to supply a supplier ID. But for pure speed, I'm not going to bother. I'm going to hard code that in there. So what we're hoping for is that when this webhook activates, Extension Kit is going to go and get us a token based on these details, and then it's going to call the supplier's API to get that information. So if we save this flow, we can actually run this directly from within Extension Kit immediately. So let's do that. Let's hit the run button. We're not providing any information to it. We're purely going to run. And now if we look in our history, we can see that it started and it ran, it was manually triggered. So let's look in here and see what information we got. The step one is actually our call out to the supplier's API. And we can see that it ended up with a status of OK. So it must have succeeded. It went off and it went and asked for the bearer token, and then it made our call to the supplier's API. And if you look at the output that came into it, here we go, the response. This is our JSON that defines our Tech4 consulting supplier. Now to check that this works externally, we can look at the overview of this webhook, and here you can see we're provided with an address. So let's copy that. Let's hop into Postman, and we can make a new request in Postman, and we can paste that request in for the webhook. Now webhooks are always post requests. If you'd issued a get one, you wouldn't get anything. This is a post request. So we're going to send this, and we're not going to get any content back. And that's because when we actually created this webhook, the primary response configuration, we didn't set anything here. We could have set it to 200 and we get an OK. But let's see if it actually ran it. And it did. Here's our run. It wasn't manually triggered. This is what's coming from actually hitting it with Postman. And exactly the same worked. It finished with an OK, and it went and got our details. So this is a very simple overview of how you actually call a API from Extension Kit. What we would be doing in reality is we'd probably be getting information and posting it back into the system. But the concept would be the same. You would be providing your authentication details, the URL to where the API endpoint is, and then providing the data required. And that's all there is to it. Of course, if you want more information on that, there's going to be additional Extension Kit training courses that are going to run from this training site. So have a look out for those. And they will go into much more detail about the flows, what you create, what you can do with them, how you write liquid script, and all those kinds of details. So if you need more information on Extension Kit, jump into one of those courses.